A lot of people don't like repaying student loans. I certainly didn't like to pay mine back, but you know what? They're a necessary evil. If you want a great education, I don't think there's any place better in the world than to get an education than the United States. We got some fantastic universities, but a good education costs money. Unless you're eligible for all kind of scholarships and they pay for it for you, fantastic if you can get it for free. 95% of the people out there can't. I was one of those 95%. I had student loans, and there's a funny story behind that. Maybe I'll tell you one day, but real funny story, right, honey? All right, I'll tell you real quick. I neglected to mention that I had a lot of student loans before I got married. And it wasn't until after I got married that my wife saw the mail and actually said, "Oh my goodness, who is Sally Mae, and why does she say you owe her so much money?" I'll never forget that day as long as I live. And my wife made me promise to pay back my student loans as quickly as possible. So student loans are things that very rarely will go away. Student loans are one thing that anybody in college who takes them out, law school, medical school, any kind of professional school, you go get your doctorate, they're a necessary evil for a lot of people. And again, the price of an education is expensive, but if you can get the benefits of it, I mean, it's something that's necessary in today's society. So I can't stress the good and the bad about the student loans enough. But when you're talking about student loans, folks, you got to remember one thing. When you're going forward, you got to plan about how you're going to pay these things back. Because when it comes time to pay the piper, you got to be really careful and make sure you pay these things back. Because if you can't pay them back, you can only defer them. And deferring is meaning to put them off for like a year or two while you're finishing your education or getting back up on your feet. Or what's called a forbearance agreement. And again, the forbearance agreement is to just delay the repayment. But that forbearance and deferment comes at a cost for a lot of people. In other words, the debt won't go down. They won't come after you for it right then, but the debt is still growing because there's interest on those loans. Now, a lot of people have very low rate of interest on their student loans. That's fantastic. The lower the rate of interest, the better off you are. However, what if you have like a 7 to 9% student loan? That's a problem because that debt's going to keep growing and growing and growing, and no matter how you try to chip away at it, it may not be there. Likewise, you may have heard that student loans or the overwhelming majority of student loans are non-dischargeable in the bankruptcy courts. There has not been a lot of litigation on this since the 2005 bankruptcy amendments, because when Congress went through the bankruptcy section of the code, they basically gave carte blanche to anybody who gives out a student loan. If it's a student loan, now it's a non-dischargeable debt. The only way around that is if you can get a hardship exemption. And in our jurisdiction, which is in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the 11th Circuit has adopted what's called the Brunner test. The Brunner test is a 3-part test, which is, in my opinion, almost impossible to qualify. And I don't want to go into all the 3 prongs of the Brunner test. What I do want to bring to your attention is that unless you are incapable of working, you have no way of ever paying this debt back, the chances are really good that your debt is going to be held to be non-dischargeable, which means that even if you go through bankruptcy and wipe out everything else, you're still going to have to pay this debt. So what do you do? Well, depending on what's going on, a lot of our clients go into what's called a reorganization plan, where they pay back a certain percentage of the debt over time. Remember, we talked about Chapter 13. In Chapter 13, a person commits disposable income for about 3 to 5 years. So let's say your disposable income is $200 a month. So what you're doing is agreeing to pay $200 a month to your unsecured creditors. That would include your student loans. So what happens is while you're in your plan repaying the debt back for that time frame, and every month you're making a payment, the other portion of the student loan that's not included in the plan, and I'll explain this in a second, stays outside. And that can accrue interest. So what you want to do is let's say, for example, your payment is $200 a month. Well, if you have to pay $200 a month anyway, you want your student loans to get a piece of that action. For example, let's say your student loans are $100,000 and you have $100,000 in credit card debt. Well, that's $200,000 and your payment is $200. So 50% of that $200 payment is going to go to the student loan people. So you want that money being paid to the student loans in one way, shape, or form. The problem is that beast is growing outside the bankruptcy. So what happens to a lot of people when they get out of the Chapter 13, even though they've paid money back to the student loans over the time, they get out and the debt's just as big as it was before. So in some cases, 13 works for some people if they can have a way of getting down that other debt, if they can borrow from relatives or if they can do something to get that debt down, great, 13 will work for you. Alternatively, Chapter 7 sometimes is the way to go to get rid of all the other debt, and then after the Chapter 7, that person can start applying all income directly to the student loans only. I mean, there's sometimes, there's a lot of tricks, not a lot of tricks, but sometimes you can have some interesting things happen in the bankruptcy court. And one specific example was this. I had several years ago, I had a person who had student loans. We had to file a Chapter 13. 7 wasn't an option. In the Chapter 13, we paid back all the creditors a certain percentage during the first 36 months. But then what we did is for the next 2 years, from month 37 to month 60, we paid back just the student loans. So for that extra 2 years, we had the full court protection. And we were able to pay back the rest of the student loans. So when that person got their discharge or received their discharge, not only did they get the discharge on all the other debt, but they walked out free and clear of all debt because now the student loans were paid, the rest of the unsecured creditors were discharged, and it worked out really well for that person. Isolated incident. I haven't seen a case where it worked out that well for anybody since, so what we wind up doing is either the Chapter 7 or the 13. In the 7, remember, we can get rid of pretty much everything else, leaving the person with just going forward, paying the student loans, which works out well for a lot of people. Alternatively, if you have student loans and you have to go to Chapter 13, then you want to include the student loans and let them receive as much as possible of the disposable monthly income so that when you get out of the bankruptcy, then you have an option of really trying to bang down that debt as much as possible. So, I mean, the student loans aren't going to go away. That's the problem. And if they don't go away, they're going to make your life miserable for a long period of time. And again, you got to look at it this way. If you get the education, you got to pay for it. I have no problem with that. Paying for it's the hard part. Receiving it and going through school, that's the easy part, in my opinion.